mute when you're like
Good
this.
morning.
I don't
Good
know.
morning, yeah.
Hi. So I'm going to just share my screen. Just give me a moment. Here we go. There we go. Perfect. Let's make that big. Let's make me... Karen, can we make it small so it's just me on the screen? Okay. Okay, can you please just raise your hand to confirm you can hear me? All's good?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Okay. All right. So good morning, community, and thank you for joining me this morning. I've been doing a few online sermons, and this is one particular one which I just really wish I could have been there in person, to talk to everyone, in the room, so to speak. But I'm going to try my best to reach out to you. So hopefully you feel like, I'm there with you in some sense to talk to you today about this message, the hand of God. So to start with,
Yes.
through some readings.
Okay.
So yeah, just a reminder to please mute yourself. Otherwise I can hear everything going on in the background.
Yeah, it's yes, I got it on now.
Okay, maybe we can unmute everyone, perhaps do that manually. Okay, so let me start with the readings. Okay, so this is from the introduction to Divine Principle. In the lives of religious people, one can see an intense struggle to realize goodness by single-mindedly following the desires of the original mind. Yet, since the beginning of time, not even one person has abided strictly by his original mind. As St. Paul noted, none is righteous, no, not one. No one understands. No one seeks for God. Confronted with the human condition, he lamented, "For I delight in the law of God in my inmost self, but I see in my members another law at war with the law of my mind and making me captive to the law of sin, which dwells in my members. Wretched man that I am." We find a great contradiction in every person. Within the same self, same individual are two opposing inclinations: the original mind that desires goodness and the evil mind that desires wickedness. They are engaged in a fierce battle, striving to accomplish two conflicting purposes. Any being possessing such a contradiction within itself is doomed to perish. Human beings, having acquired this contradiction, live on the brink of destruction. So, into the quote from the Bible, from Exodus 7. "Then I will lay my hand on Egypt, and with mighty acts of judgment, I will bring out my divisions, my people, the Israelites. And the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring the Israelites out of it." And then the final quote from the Bible this morning. "Assuredly, I say to you, among those born of women, there has not risen one greater than John the Baptist. But he who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. And from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent take it by force." So for me, those quotes have always been some of the more intriguing quotes from both Divine Principle and from the Bible. Obviously, one looking at, in terms of the human condition, the duality of, the human condition in this inner conflict. And then, of course, this story of John the Baptist as someone who was also very much, afflicted by that, as we all are. But just understanding his story and his whole journey from being, the greatest and yet somehow becoming the least. So I want to kind of dig into that a little bit more deeper today, and then to end with some concluding points. And then I'd like to give some reflection, like a reflection point for you to then have a think about and reflect later on for hopefully this afternoon. So let's start with the elephant in the room, the hand of God. So for those of you obviously into football, you will remember that back in 1986, this was a famous or infamous rather incident where Diego Maradona scored a goal using his hand. And Diego Maradona was just a very diminutive player. He was 5'5". He came from a shanty town in Buenos Aires, and yet he went on to become the greatest footballer of his time. I don't know if he was the greatest footballer ever, but certainly of his generation. So in this particular incident, he essentially cheated. He used his hand, which is obviously outside the rules of football, to score the goal. And at the time, he simply said, yeah, this was the head of Maradona and the hand of God. So that's how he wanted to kind of, I guess, justify it, to kind of make it right. So in that moment, you have to understand there was a lot going on, of course, between England and Argentina. There were we'd had the Falkland War, and they had also just been going through political turmoil in the country itself. So in that moment, even though, of course, these were the days before the video assistant referee, the VAR, so there was no way they were going to be able to check it. But in that moment, essentially, in Diego Maradona's mind, he essentially, literally single-handedly defeated the English. He said, "This is revenge, for the war against England." He literally said that this is why I can kind of maybe justify it, and by proclaiming it, saying this is the hand of God, he made it into a righteous victory. And of course, for the people of Argentina and for his fans, that's all they needed to know. He even though he had cheated, but it was a victory. He claimed it as a righteous victory. It was the hand of God, no less. And therefore also somehow smiting the English for going into war. So that's literally how he positioned it, and and that's how we kind of remember it in that sense. But then this is one side of Maradona, and then 5 minutes later into the game, he scored what has been called the goal of the century. So this is the moment just before he's just about to score. He kind of feints to shoot. Peter Shilton, who was the England captain at that time, he falls down to his right, and then he kind of comes in on the inside and scores. So in the build up to this, there were 11 touches. He went past 5 players and scored this amazing goal. So in this one kind of passage of play, the 5 minutes between the hand of God and the goal of the century, you saw these two sides of Diego Maradona, these two aspects of this one man who for his country, of course, he was the greatest player. He was their captain, and yet in that moment we saw this other side where he scores the goal of the century, where this was the world watching. This was the World Cup, and in that moment we saw the genius of Maradona. And so this was the Maradona who basically he created art wherever he stepped on the pitch. He was an amazing, skillful player. So again, as we know, he passed away on I think it was 25th or 26th of November. So in this last couple of weeks, you've probably been hearing eulogies and pundits, talking about these amazing experiences they had with him, the things that he would do on the field, and what an amazing player he was. And yet at the same time, he lived this life. He had this following. Wherever he went, there was always a crowd. There was always people just baying for his every word. And I was watching something on, I think, Match of the Day, where Gary Lineker was talking about this. Gary Lineker, who's a football pundit, and actually was in that game. He himself went on to win the Golden Boot. But reflecting on the whole thing now, he remembers spending just a few days with Diego Maradona and what that was like, what that experience was like, being with this man who was essentially like a kind of messiah figure for his people. He was this person that they completely looked up to. And later on, he changed clubs. He went to play in Italy for Napoli. And here's just a little quote from a newspaper. It said, this is a local Neapolitan newspaper, claimed that despite a lack of a mayor, houses, schools, buses, employment, and sanitation, none of this matters because we have Maradona. We have Maradona. Nothing else matters. everything else is going to be fine. It's going to be, okay, because we have Maradona. So, and of course, he went on to become a legend at Napoli, winning 2 titles, and then later on he wore the number 10 shirt. So famously, they retired the number 10 shirt. They said no one now can wear that shirt. That shirt is hallowed. That's like holy. That's like no one should actually ever wear that again. And so yeah, he was this guy who inspired in many ways. So he he went on to achieve obviously other things in life. He kind of dabbled in a few things like politics, but essentially he became, like I said, there was no stretch to think of Maradona as a kind of messianic figure, at least for his country. But in those 5 minutes, going back to the hand of God and the goal of the century, it encapsulated the duality of his humanity, this conflict of good and evil within. So, and he pretty much lived the rest of his life as a kind of both a hero and a villain. So, he was this kind of character. So again, I wanted to kind of set the tone with this in terms of like, I'm not trying to say that, Maradona was a kind of like, the Messiah, but of course, for his people, he was a messianic figure. And he very much was this person who, in a very public way, was conflicted, and you could see this, conflict playing out in his life, like I said, as both a hero and as a villain. So as you know, recently we had the third Rally of Hope, and we had this gentleman, George Weah, come and speak. And I don't know if you know, but George Weah himself was also a former World Player of the Year, like what would be now known as winning the Ballon d'Or. He was an incredible player. And of course, when he addressed the Rally of Hope, he wasn't just addressing it as a former like a World Player of the Year, but this time he was addressing the world as the 25th president of Liberia. He took his platform as a footballer and then went into politics and successfully, went on now to run as president. So people in this position are very few and far between who can take a platform and then go on and think, okay, how can I build on this? What can I do on the foundation that I've been given? So people like, I think, George Weah, and of course, even if I think about our local pastors, working in the field, I often think it's not easy to be a leader, and particularly it's not easy to be a religious leader. If you think about, again, John the Baptist, it's not easy to be in that position where you're somehow the greatest, and yet potentially, or you're in that, like it said in the in the introduction to the divine principle, you're on the brink of destruction. You're living in this very tentative kind of state where you're often kind of being challenged. So and again, people like Maradona, or people like perhaps George Weah, for his people, they expect you to be like a Superman. People, when they look to a messianic figure, they're looking for someone to be more than just a man, a Superman, godlike. But we know we are but a man. We're not a Superman. But yet the world is looking at you, expecting you to be like that. So most of us are never going to become like great footballers or presidents, or let alone both, like George Weah. But nevertheless, we have a providential role to play, and of course we have our own battles which need to be won. So let's take a look now at some of these historical providential players. So of course we have John the Baptist, and I've just put the quote up again there. I don't really want to read it again, but just to draw your attention to this last line: the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent take it by force. So to kind of give this a bit of context, and again, like I said, this is a quote that I thought about a lot, even going back, to the early days of my spiritual life. Like, what is, how could this have happened? What does it mean? And how does it particularly, of course, relate to what could happen to me as someone who's also perhaps on a path? I don't particularly claim to be some kind of pastor or a religious leader, but I know I'm on a certain path, and I know that involves me in a certain way. So let's give this some context. So to do that, I want to look at another quote from the Bible. This is Matthew, verse 5. Whoever therefore shall break one of these least commandments and teach others to do so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever shall do and teach them shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So I've put the emphasis here on the doing. So, it's all well and good, teaching and telling others what to do, but what are you actually doing yourself? What's the connection between what you think, what you say, and then what you actually do? And of course, in this quote, we're getting very clearly the message that if you just think and say, then you're in danger of becoming potentially a hypocrite, because you're not walking the talk. You're just talking about it, and even worse, you're teaching other people when actually you yourself are not doing it. So therefore, that person shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. So for me, this has been a very useful kind of reference in terms of understanding what happened to John the Baptist and about this conflict within. So if I want to just draw your attention to, this idea that, he as a person was obviously, there to proclaim Jesus. He came as a John the Baptist figure to, sorry, I've just jumped ahead on one slide there. Going back to John the Baptist, he came as a figure to, to proclaim Jesus. And yet at some point, because he was obviously talking about it, he was teaching other people, but when it came to the crunch to proclaim, he didn't do it because he didn't follow through. As we know later on, he kind of thought himself into trouble. He overthought the whole thing and eventually came to say, are you really he who is to come? Or shall we look for another? So, at one point he kind of got it, but then he overthought the whole thing and eventually thought, well, I don't know. And maybe, you can relate to this in the sense that sometimes we get something, but then we think about it, and we get into a muddle. And John the Baptist got into some kind of muddle and eventually denied Jesus. He didn't proclaim. In the end, he was talking about it, teaching other people. Oh, he's such a great teacher. Oh, he's amazing. But when it came to the crunch, he couldn't do it. So, unfortunately, John the Baptist, I remember even studying about John the Baptist in school. And for me, I just remember him, oh, he's that guy who got his head chopped off. Because that's a very graphic image. It's like, oh my God, what happened? He ends up with his head served on a platter. And that's how I remembered him. It's like, oh, John the Baptist. Yeah, what happened there? So, and then at the same time, he was the greatest, among those born of women, there is no one greater than John. And yet, in the process, he ended up becoming the least in the kingdom of heaven. So this is something, again, I just wanted to kind of touch on as to kind of, to look at this idea of, how does the kingdom of heaven actually come about? What's actually going on? So I want to look at another figure in the Bible. This is Tamar. Now, I really like this image. I just found this online. It's by a photographer who did a series of pictures. So this is a very strong and powerful image of Tamar. So in contrast to someone like John the Baptist. Now, for me, John the Baptist, he's very much like these kind of intellectual types. I think just as a very as a generalization, I think there's a tendency for intellectual types to get into this kind of muddle, to kind of overthink, and then they start to pass on their concepts to other people, and often those people are vulnerable in some way, and so they're kind of trying to implant their thoughts on others. And of course, people believe them because, hey, you're intellectual, you know better than me, right? And and of course we can think of other figures like, of course, Lucifer, who was the morning star, very clever guy. But we know that he was also guilty of that in the Garden of Eden. But that's a whole other story. But again, in contrast to someone like that who kind of thinks and is intellectual, for me, Tamar was this powerful woman. She was a woman of force. And and this idea of how did a non-Israelite woman, best known for dressing up as a prostitute and seducing her father-in-law, become a celebrated ancestor of King David and of Jesus? I thought about this, over the last couple of days, and for me, I kind of encapsulated it into this one sentence, that a woman of will combined with God's will is a very powerful force. What Tamar did I don't know what more would constitute, forcing the issue than what Tamar did in order to continue the lineage that led to, the genealogy of Christ. She was faced with this challenge. Her father-in-law, her husband, of course, her brother-in-law, and then eventually she did something to force the issue. She was this woman of will, but she was acting with God's will, and that's a very powerful combination. To have someone like that. And of course, we know that in history, then there were others, who came together, with women like Tamar. So there was Ruth, there was Rahab, there was Bathsheba, and of course Mary. These are the women who were kind of quite critical in terms of the genealogy that led to the birth of Jesus. So for me, this idea that she forced the issue, she in the same way that again, like I said, like the analogy of the hand of God, that was forcing the issue, right? He was like, I'm taking this gold no matter what. He took it and he proclaimed it as a victory. He wasn't sitting back trying to think, oh, I can't do this, because it's what Tamar did is completely outside the bounds of sexual and ethical boundaries. It's completely suspect what she did, but she went through with it anyway, because for her this was the will, and this was God's will, so she had to do it. And and that way the kingdom of heaven could take one step forward, or at least one step forward to accomplishing the kingdom of heaven. If she hadn't have done that, then of course it would have stopped right there and then. So again, just as a contrast to John the Baptist, she was forcing the issue. She was acting, with this very clear sense of her will and God's will, and she made that happen. So here's an image that I got. This is Aaron and Moses going to the Pharaoh, and I've just kind of put this quote here. This is I don't know if you know the reference. That's not a knife. If you've watched the movie Crocodile Dundee, I'm going to maybe show you if I can. It's okay. There's a scene in the film Crocodile Dundee where Crocodile Dundee is just this character who's come out of the outback in Australia and is in now the kind of downtown ghetto of New York, and he's walking around there with his friend, and then these guys, this little gang comes up to him, and they've got a knife, and they like saying, "Give us your wallet, give us your money." And he's like, "Hey, what's going on?" And his friend says, "Oh, give them the money." And he says, "Why?" He says, "Oh, they've got a knife." And then he goes into his, into his pocket, and he pulls out this huge knife, and he says, "That's not a knife. This is a knife." And of course, they immediately surrender. They're immediately subjugated by this act of like, this guy is just like, like we're just boys. We're just like, we're playing with toys. This guy's a real man. He knows exactly what he's doing. That's a knife. And so when I think about this scene, if you like, in the Bible, that's how I kind of, for me, that's how I kind of picture it, is like, the Pharaoh has got his, sorcerers to create these serpents. And then, Moses and Aaron, they put their staff down, the rod, and it turns into this huge snake, and it basically devours all the other snakes. And it's like, that's not a knife, that's not a snake, this is a snake. And for me, this is a very interesting analogy in terms of like how, again, in this moment, just like those kids in the film, they completely surrender. They just run away. They know that they have been defeated without even lifting a hand. All he did is just show them, this is a knife. And in the same way, Moses, like, of course, at this point, Pharaoh, his heart is still hardened, but step by step, as we read in that Bible verse, at the beginning, eventually he's broken down. Eventually he's brought to this point of submission. But for me, it's very interesting that, this is done in a way that actually, let's say in a language that people understand, like, those kids, they wouldn't have understood anything else. If he'd said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I don't have any money, and can you please let me go?" They might not have understood. All he had to do was say, "This is a knife, like this is the snake. My snake is bigger than your snake. In fact, it can devour all your other little snakes." And that's all you need to know. And for me, again, that's forcing the issue. That's like taking, control and naturally subjugating that situation and saying, okay, who's actually really in charge here? So for me, later on in that story, of course, we know that the hand of God was very much demonstrated with the plagues, and again, that, the plagues that was not pretty, right? Those plagues, the locusts and all the rest of it, turning the Nile into blood, that was not a pretty situation. It wasn't like, hey, I'm going to do something to inspire all the people to somehow follow. That was a very clear judgment. And again, it's showing that, there's not just like the hand of God is not just about, I don't know, doing something wishy-washy or doing something, kind of just singing and dancing. It's about putting down, the judgment and saying, this is where we stand. So I wanted to also look at, talking about, of course, providential figures. I wanted to just share a story about True Family. Now, this picture, I'm sorry, the resolution is not the best, but, I was recently in Portugal, and I was I was staying at the center there, and in the kind of national leaders office, I came across once again this picture. It's one of my favorite pictures of True Family. You can see like all the family then. I remember being in that office and I was just staring at this picture for ages, just looking into each a member of the True Family's face and just trying to understand their story, understand what they've been through, what they're going through now, and understanding their life, in the context of some of the things that I've been sharing about now. And, for me, one of the stories about True Family that's always been quite moving and has always been a reference point was how True Family were able to turn tragedies into victories. And there's one member of the family who's obviously not in this picture, and that's Hung Janem, who passed away in a car accident. And in that moment, of course, for all of us who are parents, it's a massive tragedy, right? To lose your child in whatever circumstances. But for me, what father did at that time is like, it's not human. Like, it's not human what father did in terms of turning that tragic situation into a victory, and not only a victory, but a victory of love. To be able to do that, for me, that one act alone tells me a lot about the kind of person that father was, and what, True Family themselves, what kind of life they were, living, in terms of having to continually turn these kind of tragedies into victories. So, I think likewise right now, we live in tragic times. The world is not peaches and cream. And, I don't know about you, but there are many things that, I can look at in the world, and it breaks my heart, when I see the situation of what's going on in the world. So, we may fail sometimes, or others may actually fail us. But I know that, again, if we go back to this passage in the divine principle, if I single-mindedly follow the desire of my original mind, then a victory is on the horizon. The original mind says this tragedy can be turned into a victory. This controversy could be made into a righteous victory. That whatever the situation is, if I can hold on to my original mind, if I can stay straight, if I don't perhaps overthink the whole thing, if I just do and carry on and, force the issue. No, I'm not going to let Satan claim this. I'm going to claim this victory. I will proclaim that victory. I will take this situation and bring it back to God. So I wanted to kind of end with a few concluding points. And I think some of these points are quite loaded. So, I don't want to go into it like in too much depth, but I kind of would like you to spend some time to think about it. So here are my kind of concluding points. So people are still conflicted, but, we have a choice. It's not like we've suddenly now become perfect. It's not like what the divine principle talks about in the introduction, that, we are, we on the one hand delighting in the law of God, but yet, we are wretched. We are still, living in that conflict, but we have a choice. We know that. And if we just think or talk about the kingdom of heaven, then it's going to pass us by. So we have to do, we can't just be thinking about it. We have to do, take action, and even excel and surpass what is set as the standard in this world. Show people that, yeah, I got my snake or whatever it is, that what I do is the best. It excels, it surpasses anything else because you're doing it. You're creating that standard, you're setting that kind of benchmark, you're creating a victory out of almost what is almost could be seen as nothing. But you're doing it. You're not just thinking about it. And worst of all, you're not just thinking and telling other people when you yourself are not even doing it. You're not practicing it. So this idea of, take action, do. So we may fail sometimes, or others will fail us, but we must keep on going. The victory is around the corner. And when we get there, we reach that summit, we will no doubt face the next challenge. So there will be another mountain to climb. Every time, if you look at true family, especially the life of father, every time there's somehow, a victory achieved, then there we are, we set the next goal. Here's the next 7 years, or here's the next big thing that we're going to do. So we're not going to rest on our laurels. It ain't over yet. We have generations of work to do. So that's the next mountain. So, that sense, never be in that sense content. Because, if you look at successful movements, every time they reach a certain victory, they immediately set the next target. They immediately put in front, no, let's not be satisfied. This is where we need to go next. This might be, a victory now, but unless we continue, we're going to lose it all. So we need to keep on moving. In fact, set, an even more difficult task ahead of us. And this last point, in terms of concluding, this is perhaps the more, I've been watching a lot of mythology, and one of my sons and I, we're kind of into mythology. But this is just something I wanted to share. Take from it what you will. So peace is achieved by a force. Maybe even if you think about Star Wars, use the force. Peace is achieved by a force, a will to overcome our human condition of internal contradiction. So internally, defeating the serpent that is within us is like an act of devouring yourself through natural subjugation. That's something that we have to do if we're going to overcome that conflict within, if we're going to step out of being always on the brink of destruction. That's not a way to live. That's just the state that we're in. But to go beyond that, we need to kind of, in that sense, overcome, naturally subjugate, devour the serpent within, and then achieve peace, and then find your bliss, whatever that may be. So to give you a final reflection point, I wanted to just give you this as a point for your prayer and perhaps discussion later on in our groups. So life is not a story of continuous victories. Going back to Maradona, he had that 5 minutes, but his life was, completely full of other challenges. So likewise, life is not a story of continuous victories, but of overcoming countless challenges and perhaps achieving only that one all-important victory where you leave your mark on this world. So in the scripture that is called life, because we're all living that scripture, we're all in that, before we're talking about the Bible, I'm talking about these historical figures, but we are living in scripture. It's called life. It's us. It's the human condition. It's how we can make, those steps going forward. So in the scripture that is called life, how will you be remembered? So thank you, brothers and sisters. Thank you, community, and especially North London for joining us as well this morning. I'm going to say a concluding prayer, and then we have time for reflection, and I'll join you also in the groups later. Please join me in prayer. Our dearest Heavenly Father, our loving parent. We are so grateful, and we want to be able to come on this Sunday morning to worship and to take time to put our lives back on track. I know I need to do that. And Father, each one of us, because we live in a certain internal state of wanting to do what is right, wanting to follow our original mind, but sometimes losing connection with that, sometimes losing direction. We need to center ourselves. We need to get ourselves back onto understanding how we can even do that. And rather than just thinking about doing that, maybe it's best that we just start doing it. Find something and start. Don't make it complicated. Don't make it into some excuse, but just let's start. Let's do it today. Whatever it is that we can do, we can put it into practice. And I'm sure that by taking that first step, the next step will reveal itself. And we will start to see actually where we can truly make a difference and leave our mark in this world. That no matter what we have done, no matter whatever failures that we might have, Father, experienced in our lives, and no matter how much we think we are perhaps not worthy or not capable, but actually, nevertheless, each one of us has it within us to be that providential victor. And therefore, let us continue to live our lives with that sense of providential purpose. Heavenly Father, we are once again looking to use this time, the rest of this, at least this morning and this afternoon, to at least consider and reflect and think about these things. And I hope you can be able to guide each one of us. And we can actually take that step with you. So we're not waiting for you, Father, to just to hear our prayers. And we're not just dreaming about how we can do something great, or, what is our faith and how can we believe in you. But actually, Father, we want you to be able to believe in us, that we can, Father, do it. I report these things and offer this prayer in my name. Ajay Rai, husband and father of a blessed central family. Arju.